Hi, welcome to session 2, Basic Equipment Needs. My name is Lorene Keel, and I'd like to give you at least a little bit of idea of some of the things you'll need as you're beginning your beekeeping journey. We're going to talk about buying equipment, and we're going to cover what do you need, which will include the hives, or as known in the business, your woodenware. These are basically the wooden boxes and all the other accessories that you will need for your bees to be protected from the weather. You'll also have some protective clothing needs. You will require some tools and, of course, your bees. I will not spend a lot of time on buying bees. Joe Hyder will give you an idea of what all you have as options for those bees. So I'm just going to touch on it in passing. There's two types of hives that are primarily used in the United States. They are the Langstroth hive, which is shown on the left picture, and there's what's called a top bar hive, which is shown on the right. As you can see, the Langstroth hive has a vertical orientation. The bees build up in strength and along the foundation and waxware in a vertical position, while the top bar hive is a horizontal position, and the foundations and where the bees build up are side to side. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. I'm going to briefly talk about some of the differences. The Langstroth hive was patented by Reverend Lorenzo Langstroth. He patented it in 1852. And again, part of what was cool about this patent was he made a way to standardize equipment and make it possible for a beekeeper to inspect their hives without destroying bees and honeycomb. Prior to this time, oftentimes people kept bees in logs, something they called gums, or they kept them in bee skeps or clay pots, which required honeycomb to be essentially destroyed every time you went to go harvest honey. And there was no real good way to get at that precious comb without destroying it and potentially destroying the whole hive. As you can see from this picture, there's multiple parts that go into a Langstroth hive. On the very bottom, you see a hive stand, and that's basically something that gives the bees a landing board and an area to keep that hive and that wood ware out of the dirt and mud. That certainly can be replaced by simple cinder blocks and various hive stands. Above that is something called a bottom board. That can be a solid piece of wood or a screened bottom board, which gives the advantage of a varroa mite control mechanism and also ventilation in the summer. This becomes the front entrance for your hive, for your bees to go in and out. And you see a little small piece of wood called an entrance reducer that can be used to decrease the size of the entrance depending on time of year and the strength of your hive. Above it, there's a deep super. This is shown as one single hive body being used to raise the brood for the hive. It often consists of more than one box, one hive body. It depends on what equipment you're running, but the standard is usually 1 to 2 deep supers in a 10-frame equipment. Above that super, that spot for babies to be raised, the brood to be raised, is a queen excluder. The queen excluder may or may not be used. It's a bit of an optional equipment, There's a whole bunch of opinions about whether to use it or not. In this particular diagram, they have it above that brood area. It's used to keep the queen down and where you want her to lay eggs, and to keep her from laying eggs up in your honey collection area, which on this diagram are labeled honey supers. They've got 2 honey supers there. It's not uncommon to run several honey supers if in fact it's the time you're harvesting honey or nectar's coming in. You're on a nectar flow. Above those honey supers, you see what's called an inner cover. That's a simple piece of ply with a rim that helps make it easier for you and as a beekeeper to get in and out of your hives. It makes it a little bit easier for you to use one of your hive tools and pry off the inner cover without ripping out comb. And on the very tippy top is an outer cover. It's essentially the roof of the whole shebang. This one happens to overhang the whole hive on all 4 sides. That acts as a drip edge for rain and snow and to help keep your hive and your bees warm and cozy. You got many choices in buying woodenware or the hive bodies. You have to make a choice when you buy by both the width and the depth of those hive bodies, those boxes. You've got 3 main choices in the width. It's either a 10 frame, it's an 8 frame, or it's a nucleus. The 10 and the 8 frame differ in the number of frames that fit into the box. Obviously, either 10 or 8. And the nucleus hive is a little baby hive that beekeepers often use for starting out new colonies or to catch swarms in or to test whether or not a queen's going to be a good layer. Additionally, you get to choose when you're buying these hive bodies, your woodenware, the depth. And you'll see described in bee catalogs, deeps, mediums, and shallows. And essentially, they are different in how high those boxes are. And when you combo the width and depth, obviously you have a whole bunch of selections to make for choosing your boxes. This just demonstrates the dimensions of a standard 10 frame equipment, and it's to illustrate those differences in heights of the potential boxes. Again, the first picture I showed you with that Langstroth hive demonstrated a deep hive body for the brood chamber, the chamber where that queen was able to use for laying eggs, and they had their brood raising going on. Its depth is 9 5/8. Traditionally, 10 frame equipment is used. It doesn't mean you have to use 10 frame equipment. It also doesn't mean that you have to have one single brood box for your queen. Oftentimes, beekeepers use 2 brood boxes to allow young to be raised. If you were to replace your brood area with medium boxes, the recommendation would be approximately 2 to 3 deep boxes, and 3 mediums would replace the dimensions of 2 deep brood boxes. So I want to correct myself. That really would be 1 to 2 deep brood boxes, or if you wanted to run medium equipment, it would be at least 3 medium for your brood chamber. You can also use shallow equipment for running all that, but obviously you're limited on the size and you have to run more height to run the same dimensions. Most of the time, people use honey supers that are either mediums or shallows. And I'm going to discuss that here briefly. Why size does matter. The choice of box size does make a difference because it's the weight that changes. This sounds pretty obvious, but I think people need to realize we're all getting older and backs are important to keep in shape. And you can have some heavy lifting involved in beekeeping. So the choice of choosing the size you want from the beginning and matching up the size of the boxes when you're starting out can be pretty overwhelming, but it's important to consider. A 10 frame, which is probably the standard equipment for most commercial beekeepers, a 10 frame deep full of honey can run 8 to 100 pounds. That's a heavy lift depending how high it is. A deep box versus a medium versus a shallow, obviously based on the depth of the box, progressively decrease in weight. And I usually use the rule of thumb, it decreases in weight by approximately 20% as you downsize in your depth. So if you're talking a deep full of honey, you're talking maybe 80 pounds. With a medium, you're talking about 60 pounds versus a shallow 40 pounds. And again, a little give and take depending on how full it is of honey. You can also run your bees in 8 frame equipment. Obviously, it's about 20% lighter than 10 frame equipment. You're 2 less frames. So again, if you're a deep full of honey in 8 frame equipment, you're talking 60 to 80 pounds. And again, the same thing holds true. A deep box versus a medium box versus a shallow progressively decrease in weight. My opinion is choose wisely what kind of lifting you want to do for your beekeeping career. If it's a hobby, you might want to work with lesser weights. If you're older, if you have some arthritis, if you have some back issues, if you're a woman versus a weightlifter, you want to consider that when you're buying your equipment. And anytime you look at catalogs, they usually have a selection of kits. They have a selection of equipment. Choose that equipment that you think meets your needs. What goes into each of those hive bodies is basically a frame, which is the wooden piece you see here in this picture. It has ears that fit into a little rabbet in that box to allow it to be fit in snugly and also allow you to pry it out and move it around. And inside that frame, it has some foundation. The foundation in this picture is a wax foundation, and you can see that there's some wire running across it. That's to add strength and rigidity. And the bees will take that foundation, pull out honeycomb, and use it to store basically 3 things. They'll lay eggs in it. The queen will lay eggs in it, and they will raise brood. They may, in fact, put the nectar in it to produce honey, or they may use it to store pollen mixed with honey, which becomes bee bread. So the foundation is an important consideration when you're setting up and buying equipment for what kind of foundation you want. Again, I alluded to the Langstroth hive having this magical movable frames to make it easier to get in and work your bees. These are the multiple choices that you have for foundation. In the upper left-hand corner, you have the choice of plastic foundation. It can be an all-in-one piece like this, or it can merely be the insert that you put in that wooden frame that's plastic. I don't particularly like these all-in-one plastic foundation forms. I've had a problem with hive beetles in the past getting into those little corners, and I really don't like it. Plastic foundation that I pop into a wooden frame, I do like. Below that, on the lower left-hand corner, you can see again wax foundation with the exploded diagram with the wiring indicated there. On the upper right-hand corner, you see again a wooden frame with wiring across, and up the top you have what's called a starter strip. It's another way that you can have bees pull out comb on it with a little bit of a template. It's a different way of dealing with the bees and making sure they pull it out nice and straight, and does require a little bit more tricks of the trade. And right below that, at the lower right-hand corner, you see freeform comb. There's no starter strip. There's no foundation in it. You basically let the bees do what they do. And again, there's some tricks of the trade to keep it nice and straight and cut out something called burr comb. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. A little bit more finesse with that. So those are the four major choices you have for foundation choices. I'm going to talk a little bit about the top bar hive. It's the darling of a lot of natural beekeeping. I think it requires a different skill set. So I'm just going to kind of mention some of the differences in it and make a few comments about it. The top bar hive, as I alluded to earlier, is a horizontal configuration. The bees build right to left or left to right. You can see it has entranceways. It's almost a one-piece hive without additional levels on top of it, in contrast to the Langstroth hive. The lower left-hand corner shows how that comb is built onto what's called top bars. And those top bars on that right-hand lower picture show a little triangle that is your attachment point to encourage the bees to draw their comb down from there. Again, these combs run from left to right. It's a horizontal configuration of the hive and the comb. And notice there's limited attachment points of the comb. They're primarily attached at the top on those top bars. With no frame and no foundation, except for that very top, you need to be extremely careful about handling those bars and that honeycomb, because mishandled, you will loosen that comb and the comb will drop off. So there's a strength issue and a totally different way of handling your frames and inspecting your hives than there is for a Langstroth. Top bar hives may require a different skill set than Langstroth. No, they really do. And they may not be the best way to learn beekeeping. You need to realize this and talk to the right people depending on your choice of hive. There's something, and I'm just going to mention it in passing. There's something called a long hive, and it's a hybrid of the top bar and Langstroth hive. It primarily deals with the foundation set into a frame with wood all the way around based on the dimensions of a Langstroth hive, but it runs horizontally versus vertically. It's another way of dealing with less of a reach above your head or above your waist, and a different way of having bees in a hive. I mention in passing because you may hear that in talk with beekeepers. Bee space. Again, there's a Langstroth standard, and part of what he determined and patented was there was a standard bee space of about 3/8 inch. Bees like a certain space. If it's too big of a space, meaning your hive is spaced greater than 3/8 inch, they will do something called burr comb. It makes a mess of your hive. It makes it hard to inspect. You run into difficulty with potentially killing queens, breaking apart the hive, losing honey. If it's smaller than 3/8, it becomes too small. Bees consider that a crack. They fill it up with something called propolis, which is bee glue, caulk, if you will. It essentially covers up air openings and spaces. They use it for an anti-infective. They can also cover up foreign bodies that are too big for them to pull out. Say if they killed a mouse in their hive, they'll cover it with propolis. And if it's the right size of bee space in a hive, it becomes a crawl space, similar to what you see here down in the lower right-hand corner. And again, bee space was something that became patented with the Langstroth hive back in the 1800s. This is an illustration of what happens if you leave things open and let the bees do what the bees are going to do. This is a bee space violation. You see on the top that all those frames don't have any starter strips. They basically have no foundation. And guess what? The bees have filled it in their own beautiful design. The problem is you get in there, you cannot tell if you've got a queen in there laying. You rip things apart. You have honey dripping at the forefront of this picture, potentially killing queens and losing a crop of honey. I want to move to what you need to buy for personal protective equipment. As you can see down there at the lower portion of the slides, sometimes when you're inspecting a frame, you got your face right up in the frame, trying to see what's going on, potentially looking for a queen, looking for eggs. You can get pretty close to those stinging insects. So bee suits on the left with a bee veil, a simple bee veil setup, and gloves are necessary for part of your personal protective equipment. A veil is about an absolute in beekeeping, again, because you're working with stinging insects, and a lot of time you're up close and personal. Gloves are also, when you're new and learning, gloves are a good thing to have. I don't suggest always getting heavy, bulky leather gloves. I suggest oftentimes learning to work with nitrile gloves, as long as you're not getting black in color and you're getting like a 3 to 5 mil nitrile glove. And again, suit veil gloves. You should have this, and always, always protect your face. Facial stings are ugly and not something you want to mess with. And this gentleman has it all happening. So always protect your face. Additional tools that you need are a smoker, a hive tool, which is the upper right, and potentially a bee brush. Spend the money on a good smoker. Spend the money on a decent hive tool, if not one, maybe two. The bee brush, I give that a if you want it, it's good. There's uses for it. The bees really don't like the bee brush, but I have two of them. Hive tools, like I said, choose. Unfortunately, like many things in beekeeping, there's a whole bunch of hive tools you get to choose from, and you'll find this often the case with much of beekeeping. You don't need all the bells and whistles, but you need decent tools. Optional equipment may or may not be an EpiPen. That's an entirely different talk. Many people who are beekeepers keep an EpiPen. They are expensive. You need a prescription, and they outdate fairly quick. And obviously you need bees. That's a queen and workers. And Joe Hyder will be talking about the selection of bees and your options. Beekeeping costs. It can be either a roll of money or maybe cheap, 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 but it's not an inexpensive hobby. You have a fairly high upfront cost of beekeeping. And I tell people expect to spend at least $500. You might be able to get by with $300, but $500 is probably the minimal. And that's with doing things to keep it reasonable. And that depends slightly more, slightly less on whether you buy your equipment or whether you assemble your own equipment. And obviously, if you know somebody who can follow a plan and is a woodworker, you might be able to sweet talk them into building your equipment, ripping it, and making the rabbits. There's some simple equipment you can make on your own. And if you can hammer a nail, glue, or use a air nailer, it's cheaper to buy your equipment unassembled than assembled. Hive components, depending on what you're doing for your setup, you will spend at least $150, most likely not more. A package of bees will run you at least $130. And again, depending on where you get your packages and whether it's shipped or you're picking it up. A nucleus, which is a small starter hive, and those smaller equipment will run you at least $160 and more. And it depends on the queen selection and whether it was an overwintered nuke. Protective equipment can run you $100 and up. There's some things you can do for protective equipment. You definitely don't need a whole bee suit. A pair of good jeans tucked into rubber boots, a good shirt that's a heavier shirt, kind of a canvasy type Oxford shirt in a light color will serve you well with a veil. And again, gloves, your choice of gloves. So you can see where the cost of beekeeping equipment will put you into a serious hobby. There's also the time investment. While it's not strictly bee equipment, time is money. It has some similarities to gardening. You're busiest during that spring and summer season. You may spend a couple hours per hive every 2 weeks. I usually say every 7 to 10 days. And when you're just learning, it takes you longer to get into that hive and see what you need to see. So there's a time investment. In the fall, your preparation, which really starts in August, is a little less time. But again, There's that time investment in fall. Winter's your quiet time, you're reading, you're repairing things, you're fingers crossed hoping you see your bees in the fall. Sorry, see your bees in the spring after surviving fall and winter. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of choices to be made in bee equipment. Hopefully I gave you an idea of a few of the choices, and part of the reason that you have mentors and beekeepers to talk to is to help you with some of these choices.